Boss fights have become such an important part of Call of Duty Zombies Easter eggs ever since they were first introduced, technically back in Advanced Warfare, but then into Black Ops 3 and onward, boss fights were included as the end section of Easter eggs, most Easter eggs, not all of them, and they became an absolutely major part of these experiences. To the point where a lot of people judge Easter eggs based on how good the boss fight is. And this is completely understandable because boss fights are incredibly fun. They're meant to be this final challenge in the Easter egg that is something completely new to the player. Usually there's a brand new boss that we don't see anywhere else on the map. So when you get to this end part of the Easter egg, you are introduced to this completely new enemy that is now your final challenge. That is obviously going to be really cool. And although many of the boss fights from COD Zombies are quite incredible, I do think there is more work that Treyarch and the other developers could do in order to make boss fights even better. So in this video, I'm going to be going over how I believe Call of Duty Zombies boss fights should be designed from a gameplay perspective and other things that should be included in bosses to just make them more exciting and more interesting. Just to clarify, a lot of what I talk about in this video is going to be stuff that the developers have already done in prior Zombies boss fights, but it's not something that's always done, so I think it's worth mentioning for the sake of this video. First things first, one of the most important things that the developers need to keep in mind when designing boss fights is diversity. And what I mean by this is they need to make sure that every single boss fight they do in a singular game is very different than one another, whether it's in terms of the atmosphere or the gameplay. So throughout whatever I am talking about in this video, that needs to be kept in mind. There's going to be certain things I'm going to suggest that they should do for certain boss fights, but not all of these things should be done for every single boss fight. A great example of a game that does this very, very well is Infinite Warfare Zombies. Every single boss fight in Infinite Warfare Zombies is incredibly different from one another, whether it's through the gameplay or the atmosphere or just the overall tasks that you're required to do. None of them have the exact same structure, and that makes them all feel very unique. So the first gameplay related thing I want to talk about is how you actually attack the boss itself. One of the biggest problems with a lot of boss fights is just when you take a boss, you just give it a bunch of health, and then you just let the player go at the boss however they want, and eventually you'll kill it after you put enough ammo into it. These bosses are very boring to me. We call these bullet sponges. Now, sometimes they don't even have a lot of health, to be honest. As an example, the Order boss fight on Firebase Z is just a boss with a bunch of health, and you just have to keep shooting it until it dies. And like I said, the health isn't like an insane amount, so you can technically kill this boss within less than a minute if you're using the right weapons. And the problem with a boss like this is that the difficulty of the boss is solely dependent on how much damage your weapon does, and that's pretty much it. As long as you have a high damage weapon, you are going to kill that boss in a very quick amount of time, and that is not an interesting boss. That is not a boss that makes you think about different strategies or have different skill sets that are important for certain parts of the boss. No, none of that matters. It is just sit there, shoot the boss till it dies, and you're done. Now, there are other boss fights, for example, the Beast from Beyond boss fight, where it is a bullet sponge as well, but in a very different way, where it has a lot of health. So yes, you are just sitting there shooting at this boss endlessly, but it's also going to take you a long time. But it still has a very similar problem where the difficulty of the boss is mostly centered around just how much damage your weapon can actually do. So all you're going to do is just bring in the highest damage weapon and just keep shooting the boss until it dies. Now, of course, there are other things that are going on in that boss fight itself, so I wouldn't say it's exactly the same as something like Firebase Z, but in general, it's just all about putting as much damage into this singular boss as possible, and I don't really find that to be all that interesting. Now, there are some exceptions because there are some boss fights that do this and actually do it in a way that works. For example, 9's boss fight against the elephants are technically just bullet sponges. You just put a bunch of ammo into these giant elephants and eventually they'll die. That is how these boss fights work. But the reason 9 works for me is because, first of all, you have 2 different elephants at a time. So there's one that pops up at first, you take that one out, and then another one spawns in. So it's completely separate stages of the boss fight. You're not just attacking one enemy or maybe even 2 enemies at the same time. Instead, it's one enemy at once and then another enemy a little bit after you kill the first one. And also, the enemy itself has interesting attacks, and that keeps things a little bit more exciting. When you have something like the Rhino boss fight on Beast from Beyond, it has a lot of health, and also the attacks of the Rhino are not that interesting, so you don't really have a saving grace situation there. And of course, also the atmosphere in 9's boss fight is incredible, so that obviously helps it a lot as well. But I really enjoy that boss fight regardless of the fact that it has this one issue, which is just a thing I need to point out, because not every single one of these issues I point out is something that will immediately kill the boss fight. There are always going to be exceptions. There's also the Garad Krovi boss fight, which the dragon section is a bit different. Of course, you do just have to do a certain amount of damage to the dragon in different weak points 3 different times in different sections of the arena. That's all good and fine. But then when you fight against Nikolai, technically Nikolai is just a bullet sponge. But the reason why Nikolai really works for me is because the areas that you have to attack are actually different areas on Nikolai's mech suit. So that makes things a little more interesting as well. You're not just shooting the boss in 1 or maybe 2 different locations, you're instead having to shoot very distinct areas on the mech suit itself, which are like these specific weak points of this boss. That is interesting, and that is something that makes the boss work. And you might be wondering, where do the Black Ops 6 boss fights play into this equation? Because technically the Kraken boss fight and the Guardian boss fight are technically bullet sponges in a sense, but the reason these work is because of waves. So waves is a big part of boss fights that I think are really, really important. You don't have to have them necessarily, but I think they really help with making sure the boss fight itself has some different moments that are actually different. So a great example of a boss fight that does waves really well was, of course, the Reisendrach's boss fight, one of the first boss fights Zombies has ever done. And the way this boss works is you spawn in and you have this little section where you have to just kill zombies and wait for the Keeper to actually go in the middle area so you can put down the Ragnaroks and then start shooting at the Keeper. And once you do enough damage to the Keeper, you then get onto the next wave, which then spawns in a bunch of Panzers, and you have to take them all out and then do the same thing as you did before, where you now have to put the Ragnaroks down again and shoot the boss to do more damage, and then you get another wave of Panzers, and again you just have to do that like once or twice, and once you're done, you then finish the boss fight. But allowing you to have those waves in between moments where you're attacking the boss just gives the boss fight more variety. That's a good thing. If it was just straight shooting the Keeper all the way through, and then you had some Panzers that maybe attacked you while you did it, you can probably take out the Keeper within a much shorter amount of time, and then it just makes everything so much less climactic. I mean, just think about it, going into a boss fight and having the ability to basically just take out the boss within less than a minute if you have the right setup. That is not a fun design, and I think completely takes away what a boss fight should be. And this is exactly why the Black Ops 6 boss fights work, because of the waves. If you use the right weapons, you can actually do a lot of damage to the Guardian and the Kraken within a pretty short amount of time, to the point where you can actually get through the first stage of the boss pretty fast. But because of that little section there where you now have to wait to do more damage against the boss, it makes the boss fight immediately feel longer no matter what. You might call this artificial, and it might be a little artificial, but you know what? It works. Sometimes the game forcing the boss fight to be a bit longer is actually a good thing, because again, it makes sure that no matter how good you are, no matter how good your loadout is, you're still going to be in that boss for a decent amount of time, and it's going to be testing your skill more than anything, not just how powerful your weapons are. But ultimately, what I think is even more important than how you attack the enemy is how the enemy attacks you. And there's actually quite a lot of boss fights where the main boss itself doesn't actually deal a lot of damage towards you. A good example of this is the Zetsubonoshima boss fight, where you have to fight against Takio as this giant tree creature. He does a little bit of attacks here or there where he just kind of slaps down his branches, but they don't really do much damage, and ultimately, you're probably more likely to die to the Thrashers or the Spiders or just regular zombies. And I don't think that's like necessarily a bad thing. I don't think the boss is immediately bad because of that, but I do think boss fights tend to be more interesting when the actual boss itself is the one damaging you and attacking you. And I also think the attacks that a boss does should be very, very interesting, and there should be a lot of them. The best example of this has to be Mephistopheles, which in my opinion is the best boss fight in Call of Duty Zombies history. Mephistopheles works so well because no matter how good your loadout is, no matter how good your weapons are, it does not matter. You have to learn the attacks of Mephistopheles or you will die instantly. It is a boss fight that you can literally spawn in and get taken out within seconds, as long as you don't don't understand how the attacks work. But these are things that you can learn, and there are actual clues in the boss fight to tell you what Mephistopheles is going to do. His attacks make a lot of sense, and like I said, the more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you're going to get at it, to the point where you will easily be able to do this boss fight on multiple repeats. But it will take you a long time to learn it, because it is easily the hardest boss fight in Zombies history, which is also part of the reason why it's the best boss fight in Zombies history. When it comes to the length of the boss fight, I think anything from 5 to 15 minutes is pretty much the perfect zone. I don't think it has to be all the way up to like 15 minutes long, but there are multiple times I've had on certain boss fights where it's just like a mess, where I'm just like not able to actually deal enough damage to the point where it's going to end up taking a lot longer. A great example of that was actually one of the first attempts I had at the Kraken boss fight in Black Ops 6. I did not go in with a high damage weapon, so I was not dealing enough damage to this boss to actually kill it in a reasonable amount of time. But I was totally fine with that. I think the boss taking that long is totally fine with me. But of course, if you have the right weapons, you can probably do it in less than 7 minutes just fine. But a boss fight being any shorter than 5 minutes to me is absolute shit. It should not be that quick. Boss fights should be an exciting thing, a difficult thing, a challenging thing that really tests your skills. And it should honestly make you frustrated. You should genuinely get pissed off at the fact that you can't succeed in this boss fight, and it should take you multiple attempts to actually get through it. Those are the most satisfying Easter egg completions, the ones that actually take quite a while to beat. But one thing I'm personally not a fan of in Call of Duty Zombies boss fights is a forced time limit. This is something that they've done a couple of times, mostly in Modern Warfare Zombies, because of course that whole mode is based around time limits, but even Cold War Zombies did this with the Legion boss fight, where there was a 7-minute time limit to defeat the boss. I feel like this is a really stupid thing, just because it feels like it's forcing the difficulty to be centered around the time limit. The only reason that Legion boss fight was difficult in Cold War was because of the time limit. If you take away that time limit, it suddenly becomes a very easy boss fight, at least in my personal opinion. The time limit forces you to rush yourself and just go a lot faster, which of course ends up leading to a lot of mistakes being made. And I understand that's kind of the point, but I would rather they just make the boss harder by default and just give you unlimited time. Or perhaps make it so the boss does get harder as you take longer. So let's say you're taking way too long, maybe the arena closes in as you're playing. That would be a cool way to do it, but completely just ending the game after 7 minutes and just saying, oh, you failed because you took too long, that is really stupid in my opinion. Now, when it comes to difficulty, I think I'm always going to prefer a more challenging boss fight compared to an easy one, but I think there is a place for easy boss fights. We've had them before. They're not that bad. I think Valentina is a good example of an easy boss fight that still is really fun. I guess Cold War as a whole is just a very easy game, so it makes sense why that boss fight was so easy, but it's not a bad boss fight just because it's easy. I think the Raven the Redwoods boss fight is also relatively easy, but it's also really fun. So you don't necessarily need to have a really challenging boss fight for it to be good, but I do think it is better to have it be more challenging, because when you're having a whole Easter egg where most of the Easter egg was probably challenging at certain parts in it, you want the end of it to be the most challenging part of it. And then if you don't do that, you get a situation like Blood of the Dead, where the boss fight is actually like the easiest part of that entire Easter egg, and the Easter egg itself is way harder, which is just a really weird structure to have for an Easter egg. Another very important thing to a boss fight is the arena itself. Now, we'll talk about the atmosphere of the arena in a little bit, but I want to first talk about the actual gameplay of the arena, which of course would be in terms of the layout. Now, obviously, a more tighter layout is very obviously going to be harder. A great example of this is the Voyage of Despair boss fight. There are many moments in Voyage of Despair's boss fight where you are in very close quarters situations that do make the Easter egg quite a lot harder. But then you go to a boss fight like Garad Krovi or 9, where you have all this open space, it's obviously going to be a bit easier. But the boss is meant to be in that open space, therefore it kind of counteracts the fact that there's all that space there, because the attacks that the boss is going to do will make it not really matter that you have all this open space. And for me, I don't really think either one of these ways is the right or wrong answer for a boss fight. As I said in the beginning of the video, I think the key here is diversity. Each map should have a very different boss arena and should feel very distinct. I think that's important. I think that's good for making sure the game has as much variety as humanly possible. But what I do think is very important is that the arena you are fighting in is actually an original arena that is not something that you've already seen in the game previously. Now, I'm okay with some maps not doing this. It's not the end of the world if they don't, but I think it is much better when we have an original arena for a boss fight, simply because it allows you to learn a completely new section of the map specifically for that boss. So when you first enter that boss fight, for the first time, you are going to be completely uninformed in how this arena actually works. So you're going to have some time to kind of like explore around the layout and just see how things work. Like the first time I got into the Citadel boss fight, it was pretty crazy to see how insanely cool this arena looks, but I was kind of like exploring behind the rocks, seeing how much space I have back there. And then of course, as that boss fight goes along, you get moments where there's like lava filling up in the ground, and then it makes the arena a bit smaller, which was really, really cool because obviously it makes it a lot harder as you're getting further into the boss itself. Now, I do think reusing a location that was already seen in the map itself for the boss arena can work sometimes. A great example of this is on Raving the Redwoods. I think Raving the Redwoods has a fantastic boss fight, and part of the reason it works so well is because this island, you actually have different sections that are like cut off during the boss fight. They have these invisible walls that get created. Well, I guess they're not completely invisible. They have some sort of, effect on them, but they're mostly invisible. And I think that's really cool because it kind of changes the layout of the boss arena. So even though it was a location you could already get to before even getting into the boss fights, it still kind of works because certain elements of that location and layout are changed in the boss fight itself. Now I want to get into the conversation of atmosphere, because although gameplay is way more important, I do think the atmosphere matters quite a bit here. And so when it comes to the boss arena itself, the visuals of the arena are incredibly important, because that first time you enter that arena, if you see something that looks so plain and boring, obviously it's going to take away from how cool this boss fight is. But when you get something like the Citadel boss fight, for example, where you walk in there and it just looks absolutely insane, of course it's going to elicit a lot of positive emotions. I felt the same way the first time I loaded up the Ancient Evil boss fight, one of the best looking arenas we've ever seen in Call of Duty Zombies history. That arena is absolutely gorgeous. I would also say the visuals of the boss itself is also very important. One of the best looking bosses in any Call of Duty Zombies boss fight has got to be the God King from the Frozen Dawn boss fight. The developers did an absolutely incredible job of designing this boss in terms of the visuals. He looks absolutely insanely cool and threatening, and just the way he moves around, the animations, all that looks amazing. And so far, Black Ops 6 has been absolutely killing it as well when it comes to their boss fights. The Kraken, or also known as Patient 13, and of course the Guardian, look incredible. Another huge part of the atmosphere is the music. Now, Treyarch has always killed it when it comes to their music in their boss fights. Ever since Black Ops 3, we have had some of the best pieces of music brought to Call of Duty Zombies through the boss fights, and we are continuing to see that today with Black Ops 6. The Citadel boss fight music is absolutely incredible. Unfortunately, non-Treyarch maps didn't do as good of a job with this. There are some exceptions because, of course, the Mephistopheles boss fight has incredible music as well, but a lot of the other maps just either didn't have any music at all, or it was just very simple music that wasn't really that prominent to the map experience, or it was just reusing music either from the campaign or just from other parts of the map itself. Of course, the last thing I want to mention is just the overall story importance of the boss fight. Now, this is something I don't really care that much about. I am a big proponent of forcing a boss fight even if it doesn't really make sense in the story. I've always argued that Toggertoten should have had a boss fight even if maybe it didn't really fit thematically, just because I think gameplay should always supersede the story. Always. That's just how it should be for a video game, at least in my personal opinion. I do think the story is important and you should care about it, but the gameplay should come first. So you should be able to put a good boss fight in, even if you have to force an enemy in there in some way, shape, or form. But I think it's always going to be much better if the boss itself has some level of story importance, if there is some big reason as to why we're fighting this enemy. A great example of that is Garage Krovy itself. I mean, the fact that you're fighting Ultimus Nikolai in a mech suit is pretty huge, and then getting the cutscene afterwards where you have to kill him, that's a pretty huge moment, and a lot of other boss fights are the same way, and that's always going to be a good thing in my opinion. One last thing I wanted to mention is something that I would really like to see for future maps, but I just don't expect it to happen just because it would likely take a lot of extra resources, but I do think having multiple boss fights per map would be amazing, and not just like what Terminus did where there was like that mid Easter egg boss fight against Nathan, which was definitely a cool thing, don't get me wrong, but I want to see even even more than that. I want to see side Easter eggs completely centered around a separate boss fight that has nothing to do with the main Easter egg. Just imagine you're playing a map and there's some secret room you come across. Maybe you have to complete a puzzle to unlock some secret door. And when you get past that secret door, it leads you to a whole new area of the map. And this new area of the map leads you to a boss fight. And you get this random just boss fight that happens out of nowhere, and you have to now defeat this boss. And when you defeat it, you get a special weapon, or maybe you get a perkaholic. Like you get some sort of really good reward that's really useful and really helpful, and you then get to use that reward to actually go back and complete the main Easter egg on that map itself. I think stuff like that would be so awesome and would add so much longevity and replayability to these maps. And it's definitely something that I could see them doing down the line if Call of Duty gets a lot more resources put into zombies, which hopefully will happen in the future, but I just don't see it happening at least anytime soon, just because Treyarch is already doing so much work with so many different maps, and they're probably making next year's Call of Duty as well. That's at least the current rumor. So the chances of us getting a bunch of zombies maps with a bunch of boss fights per map is very unlikely. All in all, I absolutely love Call of Duty Zombies boss fights, and I cannot wait to see what they do for the rest of the Black Ops 6 DLC season. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Peace out, everyone.